Kingsley, good to see you. Thanks for making a bit of time to come and have a chat. I want to kick off the interview by asking you about something that you said to me that kind of stuck in my mind after we spoke a little while ago, and it stuck in my mind because I think it's probably true of me actually. You said people's networks have shrunk in the last few years. I mean, that might be true of me. I think actually. Why do you say that, and why does it matter?
I say that because to answer the first bit of the question, second bit first, I mean, I think networkings do matter. They're very important and they're fundamental to how we progress. And I'm sure we'll get stuck into that. The reason I said our networks have shrunk is actually the hidden cost of COVID is that
Yeah.
we hunker down with friends, family, and just a few business connections, what we call the inner concentric ring of our network where we've strong emotional ties, and we've let slip the kind of the outer concentric ring, where there's that's where opportunity lies, frankly, because there's difference and there's different sorts of folks of people. So in my work with corporates, I say, Paul, the five things corporates tell me the hidden cost of COVID is that there's less business development happening, there's less learning on the job, particularly for the next generation coming
Yeah.
through.
Yeah.
Uh, there's less serendipity, luck, and chance encounters and meetings. And I think luck plays a huge role in our lives. And the big question is, can you make luck happen for you or does luck happen to you? So that's an interesting discussion on that. There's less company loyalty, so people aren't staying. They're moving like never before, and there's less company culture. So they're the five biggies, and I've done it for lots of companies in the UK and in Ireland, and they would all sort of, like you just did, nod their head
Yeah.
in
Let me ask
affirmation.
you about something you just said there. That you talked about the kind of inner circle, which I get. I mean, I certainly remember during COVID, I spoke to a relatively small group of people, mainly via Zoom. Didn't meet anyone face to face for quite a long time. But you also talked about the bigger network, and so explain why the bigger network is important. Because most people, I think that it's the inner network, the people that you're close to, that is really important. But that isn't what drives business, is it?
Well, I think there's a fancy Greek word called homophily. And homophily,
Right.
I always like throwing a few Greek words into any talk, you know. And homophily means the tendency we all have to spend time with people who are just like us.
Yeah.
In other words, we're born into families like us. We go to school and college with us. We play sport. We go on holidays. We spend time. We marry people like us. But actually, that's not what the world now is. So I live in a city here in Dublin, in Ireland, where when I grew up, we used to call it male, pale, and stale. This was not a very international, cosmopolitan city. In fact, Paul, I told a joke the other day. I said, back then I went into a restaurant. I asked the waiter, what's the soup du jour? He said, hang on, I'll ask the chef. So he goes in and he asks the chef, and he comes out and he says, it's soup of the day, right? So that was then. But now, 20% of the working population of Dublin weren't even born in Ireland. So we live in an incredibly cosmopolitan, international, much, much better city as a result. But here's the question: does your network reflect the diversity of the society you live in, the economy you work in? And for most people, the answer is probably not.
Yeah. And I mean, you've done quite a lot of work around this. I mean, what sort of things, I mean, just want to pick up that particular point. What sort of things do you think people should be doing to address that?
Well, I think let me tell you the things maybe they should not do, which is maybe spend so much time on devices, on machines. So technology, which was designed to bring us all together, I actually think is having exactly the opposite effect. But I also think the biggest crisis facing the world today is loneliness and isolation. And the Harvard longitudinal study on aging, and you can Google it, and it's
Yeah.
been going on for 85 years, says that loneliness and isolation are more damaging to your longevity, to your health, than alcohol, obesity, and drugs. So I think that's a huge crisis out there. And technology, I don't think is helping. I actually think it's actually exacerbating loneliness and isolation.
Yeah, no, and I can see that. I just want to come back to one point you were talking about. I mean, in terms of the network's role in business development, I mean, my understanding of the science is that actually lots of stuff is delivered through what you might describe as weak connections, people that you don't know that well, but that will do things for you, refer you, connect you, etc. I mean, what's your take on that? I know that's only one part of the problem, but of course, a lot of people that watch this podcast are business people. What's your take on that issue?
Well, I think the way to people you don't know is through people you do know.
Yeah.
In other words, that inner circle is important because of that. And you mentioned the word of referrals. You mentioned the fact that they are the people who can make introductions. So really what you're trying to do all the time is get access to other people's networks. But people won't refer you unless, and this goes back to the old Dale Carnegie line, people do business with people they know, like, and trust. And I'm not sure that's changed a whole heap over the decades and generations, indeed. So I think that that's the really fundamental reason behind all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a really important factor because a lot of businesses depend on that, don't they? Okay, let me come back to sort of your where you're at in this. I mean, how did you get on this kind of journey? I mean, on this path, how did you get onto the path that you're on?
Well, I think I'd have to put my hand up straight off, Paul, and say, when I started out in my career, I hated networking. I thought networking was a sleazy, slimy activity for insincere people,
Yeah.
authentic people, late at night in a bar, flicking out business cards, looking for a job, looking for a sale. You wake up in the morning, you find Paul's business card and they turn up your trousers. Where did that come from? How did that happen? I mean, I just hated it. But actually, I then began to, I kind of learned, I think, a few kind of lessons about networking and the importance of this. I remember reading an article that always struck with me, and it said uh, the number one predictor of career success is being in an open network.
Mm.
And like a closed network would be if you had a party, you invited everybody you knew and they all knew each other. That's kind of like a closed network. But an open network is one where there's great diversity, there's great difference, there's people doing different things in different places. So that was the first thing I picked up. And the second thing I picked up on was that the network you have early in your career often isn't good enough for the network you need later in your career. Early in your career, you get paid for what you do, but
Yeah.
later in your career, you get paid for who you are, and your network helps you become who you are. And I think, to progress in life, you need to be smart, but there's a lot of smart people around, a lot of smart people around, but you also need to be savvy. I love that word savvy. Savvy means streetwise, you know, uh, understanding the unwritten rules of business, just being aware. There's so many things that aren't taught and you have to pick up kind of on the job. And I think that being savvy is a really important part of building networks.
Yeah. And let me ask you about that specific point about how your networks need to change. I mean, networks are really important for entrepreneurs. I mean, you were talking about you get paid for what you do at the beginning of your career. That often reflects being an employee. I mean, nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. Entrepreneurs are, I mean, one of the things that's happening in the kind of modern world is that entrepreneurs are going down that road straight out of university, straight out of college. They've developed something, they've done a piece of research, whatever, and they try to exploit that. And they're really at the beginning of their careers. I mean, what would your observations be for people that need networks but need them at the beginning of the career, and how to build those networks going forward? I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, how should you go about building a network?
And I think it's kind of circles, and I think you mentioned earlier, you need that inner circle of confidants, people who you can really confide in and you've known them a long time, etc. But they often are, as I said earlier, quite like you and do similar sorts of things. But the world is very diverse, and you've got to find ways to connect with people who don't look, sound, talk like you, because that's what the world out there is about.
Yeah.
And if you only just you'll have this, you'll end up in an echo chamber if you just talk to people who are doing exactly the same thing, look and sound just like you. So I think that making that effort early in your career to build that diversity is a fundamental to really making progress. And without it, you're going to be a little bit stymied and you're going to be a little bit sort of stuck in your ways. And here's what's interesting, Paul, nobody teaches this stuff. Like
No.
schools and colleges don't teach this stuff. In fact, when you think about it, progress at school is a function of a grade, a score, a mark, a metric. It's like a number, and you get your exams, you get that number. That's got nothing to do with the person sitting beside you in class. And then you get into the real world of work. And there's a whole series of things that count, but can't be counted. So I'm thinking of, resilience and determination and grit and humor. And then we say over here, crack, all that, all those sorts of soft things, really matter a whole lot. they really count a lot, but they can't be counted. And because they can't be counted, they tend to be discounted and they're not taught. Nobody does anything. I go into schools and colleges, I go in, I volunteer in schools, and I go into colleges, and I could be talking a foreign language for most of them because and I think the academics don't really like the topic either because it's not doesn't suit their agenda because it's about the difference between hard skills and soft skills. And hard skills are, the technical skills you need to do your job efficiently and effectively, critically important. But they get you on the ladder. The soft skills get you up the ladder. And that's what people often miss.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, I think, actually, that it's not about the stuff, the content of the stuff that you learn at college or university, is it? I mean, that's useful stuff, but it's not nearly as useful as the relationships that you build. Let me ask you specifically about some of the stuff that you're doing, because you've been doing the stuff around helping people learn about networking.
Yeah.
You're also doing something on a much, much bigger scale now, aren't you? Around the
Yeah.
different communities, different
Yeah. Yeah.
just tell us about the kind of stuff that you're doing at this kind of macro scale.
So at a macro level, I'm in a niche and it's called diaspora engagement. Now, diaspora is a fancy word that it's actually two Greek words, dia meaning over and spiro meaning scattering, but it refers to people who were born in one country, but they live in another country.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm from Ireland. Like 10 million people in history left this island. You might, from your history, we had a famine back in the
Yeah.
1840s. Our population in 1847 was 8.6 million. The population of Great Britain was 16 million. Now it's 5 million, or 6 million now to what, 55 million in the UK. So incredible divergence there. And the net outcome of all of this was that Irish people emigrated and left. So 10 million people left this island, which is the bad news. But actually, Paul, here's the good news. 10 million people left this island because now we have an empire not built by military might or force of arms, but just the fact that so many people left. And I'll give you a funny little folkloric example of that. There was once a time when the Prime Minister of New Zealand was called Muldoon. The Prime Minister of Australia was Keating. The Prime Minister of Britain of the UK was Callaghan. The Prime Minister of Canada was Mulroney. And the President of the United States was Reagan. Now, that's what we call a diaspora. These people whose forebears are from this little island went out there. But that actually, and it ties in with what we've just been talking about, that is a network.
Yeah.
That is a network that you can engage in. Now, every country's got them. In fact, I wrote a diaspora strategy. In fact, I'm going there this weekend to present it for Cornwall. So Cornwall in England had a vibrant mining industry which collapsed. And the Cornish miners went all over the world. They went to Australia, they went to South Africa, they went to Canada, they went to the US, and here's a lovely one. They went to Mexico. And in Mexico, the national dish is called an empanada. It was a Cornish pasty. That's where it came from.
Yeah.
You know, so why I'm working with the folk in Cornwall, and they're getting incredible interest from Cornish people of Cornish extraction with Cornish names all around the world. So it is networking if you like, but
Yeah.
a very specific type of niche.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly rings true with me. I mean, my mother's family are from Waterford in
Oh
Ireland,
yeah,
and
yeah.
my father's family are from Cornwall. So those two examples
You
actually
go.
kind of fit right in with me. I don't know where that leaves me,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
I mean, I certainly get your point. Let me ask you about. I mean, that's working at a macro scale, and I can absolutely see why Ireland or Cornwall or Malta or whoever would want to try and leverage their diaspora. I mean, there's a lot of logic to that. I can see that. It's rather like the kind of university alumni networks. Same sort of thing, isn't it? People that have been to university moved on, but there's lots of benefits to building those relationships. Just to put this in the context of entrepreneurs. What would you say? Let's say you're building a business. What should you be thinking about around how you utilize the kind of perhaps the people that have worked for you? I mean, McKinsey are very good at this. They do a lot with ex-McKinsey people. What's your thoughts on the way business should think about working with alumni or diaspora, or whatever you want to describe them, people that have been there and moved on? What's your thoughts about how you work with those people and how you kind of create value by doing that?
Yeah, and you're well to spot McKinsey. So I was based in Boston for 15 years, and that's where McKinsey have their global alumni office based out of Boston.
Yeah.
And they have 32,000 people who used to work for McKinsey but have left. And they spend a huge amount of time keeping in touch with these people,
Yeah.
letting these people know what their colleagues and people they work with, what they're doing. And they've built a global network. And guess what happens? They refer business back to, would you
Yeah.
get, would you believe, to McKinsey. So companies now are understanding that they have, and you said it so rightly, diaspora or alumni. I mean, the universities have known this forever. I've worked with Oxford, Cambridge, St Andrews in Scotland on that whole their alumni developing relations. So what's behind all of this? I think the thing behind all of this is a huge desire. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, to belong. We want to
Right.
belong to a football team. We want to belong to a region. We want to belong to an institution. We want to belong to a university. We want to belong to a church. I don't know what it is, but belonging, I think, is the real driver behind all of this, and that's what kind of makes this stuff happen. So you asked a question about, I think you're asking about how can entrepreneurs use this? Well, basically what you've got is a potential network wherever it is that can help you in what you're trying to do. I'll give you a little example. I used to work for IDA Ireland. IDA Ireland is the inward investment agency whose job it is to bring foreign companies into Ireland, and it's been a phenomenal success. I mean, we've gone from being, when I was growing up, 50% of the Irish economy was agriculture. It's now 5%. And that shifted over like a 30-year period because of bringing in tech companies, pharma companies from all around the world. But when Intel was a company we were trying to get, and Intel decided not to set up in Ireland, but to set up actually in Scotland. And when my boss queried why, they said because it's a bigger market and more people out of the universities in electrical engineering. So he said, hang on. And he did some research. He found 1,000 Irish electrical engineers, none working in Ireland, all working for Nixdor, Siemens, Motorola, all around the world.
Wow. Wow.
And that information was given to Intel. They changed their decision. They said no to Scotland. They said yes to Ireland. They've invested. They've 4,500 people working there. They pay billions in taxes. It's a phenomenal success. But it's just a little example of how small things, life is a game of inches, small little things can nudge a deal. And when you win an FDI, a foreign direct investment decision, great. When you come second, you know what you get? Nothing.
Yeah.
Zero. Nada. And life can be like that. I mean, I'm a fan of David Brailsford, who took over UK cycling
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
winning nothing. And he broke down cycling into every constituent element that makes up a bike winning a race. And he improved each element by 1%, 1%, 1%. And when it all came together, the result was significant. And they won, after a century of winning nothing, they won 16 medals in London, Rio, and Tokyo. They won 5 Tour de France in 6 years. He took the cyclists' beds from hotel to hotel. He took their pillows from hotel to hotel.
Mhm.
All of that micro, marginally, the theory of marginal gains, the kind of
Wow.
Kaizen, Tokyo, Japan thing. I find all that fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, it's an interesting point you make because I think, I mean, that's one example, but there's tremendous opportunities to learn from the way elite sport works for business. I think I mean, to come back to your point about theory of marginal gains. I mean, that's just one example. There's lots of ways that business can learn from sport. But to come back to the kind of the networking thing, I mean, networking is all about relationships. I mean, like you, I was never that keen on networking to start with. If you were to give a piece of advice to somebody that is at the start of their career, entrepreneur or employee, I mean, how what would you say about if you to say you need to you need to learn a network, that's one thing. How? What advice would you give to somebody that is perhaps not very confident, doesn't understand why? What advice would you give to somebody who's at the beginning of their career about building a network? I mean, what would you say to them in a practical sense, how to do it?
So, apart from the mechanics of actually doing it, to make the argument for it, I would say there's two words that are going to impact on your life if I'm talking to somebody more than any other two words in the English language. And those two words are other people. So
Yeah.
you're never going to get a job unless other people agree to it. You're never going to get a sale unless other people agree to it. You're never going to get a promotion unless other people agree to it. You're never going to get married unless other people agree to it. You're never. So what am I saying and all that? It's relationships, it's connections, it's networks, all of that stuff. So I'm justifying and making the point and hoping that people will buy into it and accept that other people hold the keys to your career progress. Decisions made by other people are going to hugely impact your life. So if they buy all of that, they'll then say, well, now I've got to go and do this stuff. So how do I do this stuff? Well, I think we often mix up networking with sociability, and we
Yeah.
think the most sociable person is by definition the best networker. And here's what's interesting, Paul. Introverts can be better at networking than extroverts. And why is that? Because they do it with decency and authenticity and integrity. They ask questions, they listen. Whereas the expert wants to wow you, wants to impress you, is looking over your shoulder to find somebody more interesting to talk to. And in any group, about a third tend to be introverts, about a third tend to be extroverts, and about a third are where I think I probably fall. I'm an ambivert. And an ambivert is somebody who really enjoys social activity, being out and about, but also needs time on their own. Needs time. I think there's a difference between being alone and being lonely.
Mm.
Need time to recharge and just to get away from everything. So when you look at it like that, and you can actually, and when I do it with groups, and I'm actually going in to do a university group this morning, but I can see these people saying, "Wow, I'm an introvert, but actually this could work for me. That's incredible. I never really thought that. I just thought it was for the noisiest, most boisterous kind of hail fellow, well met, lots of pints sort of person." No, all of us can be good at this. So what do you do then? You have to actually find out what's true and authentic about yourself and make sure other people know. I mean, you do have to make an effort to be visible. You have to think in terms of building your own personal brand, and I'm always a little bit nervous about that topic of personal brand because it makes you sound like a tin of beans. But at
Yeah.
the same time, whether we like it or not, we all are brands, and people pay more for a brand than they do for a generic product. And I love the definition. A brand is a promise that lives through an experience that creates a memory that leads to loyalty and results in sales or customers or whatever. So I think it is important that people begin to understand the fundamentals of these things. I think it's important they understand the power of, and I touched on it at the beginning, of luck, chance, and serendipity. So here's the question. Does luck, chance, and serendipity happen in a serendipitous way, or can you make it happen?
Mm.
You do things, go places, hang out with certain people, which increase the possibility of luck entering your lives. And whenever I go to a group, I mean, I ask people to think of examples, and there are always loads of examples of perchance they went here, they did that, they met somebody. But luck happens when you put it this way, luck doesn't happen lying in bed or sitting at your desk. It happens when you're out and about, when you're in motion, when you put your talents on display, when you speak to strangers, when you seek out unlike-minded people, you know, when you become good at public speaking, all of that stuff helps enormously.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely, and I've certainly learnt that along the way, so I can definitely see your point. Just to come back up to the diaspora stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
let's say, for the sake of argument, that I don't know, Belgium comes to you and says, "We want to work with our diaspora." What sort of things would you be saying to them that they need to do? Because this is a little bit more than simply going to a networking group, isn't it? Or
Yeah.
getting out of the house. I mean, at that sort of more strategic level, I mean, just give us a flavour of the sorts of things that you think are important there. And the reason I ask is because it seems to me there's a lot of talk at the moment about business ecosystems. It's a good thing, but that kind of sits alongside those sorts of things, like countries working with their diaspora, or you know big universities or companies working with their alumni. So that kind of the ecosystem kind of sits alongside that. I mean, what's your take on the macro stuff? Why is that important, and how do you encourage countries to make, not just encourage them, but how do you help them make progress around things like that?
So I just wrote a desperate strategy for Lanzarote.
Right.
I delivered it last week to the government down there. And so think about Lanzarote. Lanzarote is a huge tourist destination. The number one country sending tourists to Lanzarote is Great Britain. Number two is Ireland. It's 440,000 Irish people go there every year. But when COVID happened, the island collapsed because 85% of the income from that island comes from tourism.
Yeah.
So my job was to say, you have an opportunity here because there's no university in Lanzarote. So a lot of the smart kids go overseas, but they kind of get lost to Lanzarote. But they're actually doing interesting things in interesting places. So their resource. So what I say is, lost actors can become national assets in this sense. So the strategy, it was like a 100-page strategy I presented to them. It laid out a series of other areas outside of tourism that as a country they could get involved in. But in particular, it laid out how do you find, connect with, and engage the people from Lanzarote who've left. Now, they've left historically over the centuries. So, for example, San Antonio in Texas used to be called San Fernando and was founded by 40 people from Lanzarote. So
Wow.
then they built a connection with this Texas town, which is a very interesting town. And so they're smart. So the big question for Lanzarote about their diaspora is who are they, where are they, what are they doing? But because of things like AI and technology, but particularly because of LinkedIn. So when you think about it, 1.4 billion people in the world have told LinkedIn, here's all my education details, here's all my work experience, here's who I am, here's where I'm from. So now suddenly you can find people and you can identify them and spend time with them. And I just think, and here's the interesting statistic about LinkedIn. I was with them, I do train them in here in Dublin, and they have the European headquarters here. Less than 1% of that 1.4 billion post anything.
Mm.
So there's potential, to answer that question about who are they, where are they, what are they doing? And what's interesting now, it's become more and more not just about a country, but about a region, which is why we're just bidding for some work in Liverpool at the moment to develop a diaspora strategy for the city of Liverpool. We did it for Copenhagen a while ago, and Copenhagen is not a poor African country. It's a very sophisticated, smart European city. But there's 300,000 people outside of Denmark who are from Copenhagen, and they quite want to belong and be connected with and engage with. So it is a bit of a niche, Paul, but it's an interesting
But
thing.
it seems to me, as you were describing that, I mean, the thing that was going through my mind is that there's very clearly a connection to business and work, isn't there? Because those people that maybe were born in Copenhagen and have ended up working or living somewhere else, I mean, or running businesses somewhere else. I mean, there's a direct connection between thinking about how you engage with your diaspora and the way you engage with businesses. I mean, it seems like
Correct.
there's a connection there that it could be that. I mean, my guess is it's under exploited. People aren't really using that and making the most of that. And there seems to me that there's tremendous value there.
Well, if you look at the stats, I mean, in 1970, there was about 90 million people living outside the country where they're born in. By 1990, it was 150 million. Now it's 305 million. So migration, which is about the nastiest, dirtiest word in the English language in many ways, but let's say mobility. Mobility is the name of the game. I've got kids, one in Amsterdam, one in Berlin, and one in London, and they want to get off this small island off the edge of Europe and get out and experience life. And they're not impoverished migrants. They are smart kids, well educated, contributing to the places they're in, but they're also resourced for back here. So, you mentioned like it's really your diaspora can be important for inward investment, can be important for trade promotion, can be important for education, can be important for tourism, can be important for arts and culture. So the whole series of things that can happen. And by the way, remittances is where people send money home. I mean, remittances is $1 trillion a year industry. Now, I don't think there's many people sending money home to your town or even to my town, but remittances for. I was with the ambassador of the UAE the other day, and he said the Indians in UAE send back to India 4 billion a year. Unbelievable amount.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Let me ask you about something that kind of relates not so much to the technicalities of what you're doing, but to the way it's been shaped. I mean, how have your values shaped the way you approach this kind of work? Because you're advising governments essentially on how to exploit the diaspora, to make the most of the diaspora. There's tremendous value in that, but there's all sorts of things you could do. I mean, how have your values shaped the way that you approach that?
So I don't know the answer to the question, but let me give you a couple of suggestions. When I was a youngster, I asked my mum, I said, "What do you think I should be when I grow up?" And she said, "Be kind." I
Right.
always remember that. I always remember that because I'm at a certain stage. I'm in my third act, right, in my career. So my period now is I want to send the elevator back down. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I actually want to pass stuff on. I mean, I think I got helped enormously by people in my career, and I spent time in France. I spent 8 years in Sydney. I was 15 years in Boston. So I spent time, and people in all those places were really great to me and really helpful. I can't help them. Either they're not around anymore or I've lost touch with them. But I can pass on. I can pass it on. So, I mentor a couple of migrants in here in Dublin who've come in from Nigeria and much smarter, better educated than me in many ways, really brilliant, but they don't have any networks. They don't know anybody. That's their big issue. They don't know anybody. I know lots of people here, so I work with them. So I think it's
Sorry, can I just ask you about that? Because that's a really interesting point that you've made there is that we could help migrants that, I mean, in my case, came to Oxford or came to the UK. We could do more to help them. I mean, what sort of things would you suggest we should be doing for those people? I mean,
So
I know quite a lot, and I know quite a lot of migrants that have come to Oxford for whatever reason. Sometimes it's to go to the university, sometimes because they're building a business here or whatever. Um, it's never occurred to me to ask the question, how could I help them? And you're absolutely right. The people that have got probably won't have the kind of networks that I've got. But what sort of things might we be doing to encourage and help those people?
Well, I think one of the things you can do is to make them feel welcome.
Yeah.
And I think there's insidious racism I think it's gotten worse and worse in many ways. So I think making these people feel welcome. Now, I feel it strongly because of what I just said at the beginning of our chat. 10 million people left this island
Yeah.
and to Australia. They went to Britain, they went to Canada, and they were welcomed. I'll give you a really extraordinary statistics. In 1847, the population of Toronto in Canada was 20,000. And in that year, 47,000 Irish arrived because of the famine. Can you imagine
It's
the impact?
extraordinary. Yeah.
Staggering. And yet, the Canadians, doctors and nurses actually died looking after those people because they were typhoid ridden.
Mm.
And there's a memorial being built to them right now with some people I know. And I just think that, you know, I just think there's a human instinct in all of us. And there's not much we can do, but we can do some small things, you know? And if everybody does a little, then it makes a difference.
Mm. Mm. I mean, in terms of the sort of work that you're doing, I mean, how do you define success?
Success is where it's like in Lanzarote last week. So I presented to their government folk and all that sort of thing. And that's the easy bit. And I went down and wrote a research report and I said, here's some suggestions. The question is, will they do it? You know?
Yeah.
And there's lots of reasons for them not to do it, you know, because it's demanding resources, people, belief, all that kind of stuff. So for me, if 3 years from now, Lanzarote have put in place the recommendations I made in this report, I'd feel really, really delighted with that. And here's the interesting thing. And one of the reasons Lanzarote wants to do it, there's 8 islands in the Canaries, you probably know, Tenerife and all these other islands. They haven't really gotten into this. So Lanzarote wants to be a leader in the islands and to do this. What I'm trying to do with Ireland, I want to make us the world leader in diaspora engagement. Now, historically, we weren't. Certainly, Israel was ahead of us, and I think India is probably the one to watch
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Phenomenal, really smart, educated people. You know, they were a prime minister in your country, prime minister in our country. 400,000 Indians in Silicon Valley, they're doing incredible things. So, I just want to try and position us as, if you like, a sort of a center for teaching, training, learning in this whole space.
Let me ask
We've
you,
done 50 countries now.
yeah, what would that look like if you were to say Ireland is the leading country for diaspora engagement? I
Yeah.
mean, what would that look like in practical terms? I mean, what would you be doing? What would people be doing?
So if somebody gave me 10 million in the morning, and don't hesitate to if I mean, I'd love there to be a center, a physical center here,
Right.
like a university or an institution which basically teaches and trains. So I've got some colleagues in this business. We've worked with over 50 countries now, and the hunger and thirst for this topic is just
Yeah.
off the charts. And part of it has been the incredible acceleration just this year. Why? Because the world has dramatically changed, in a matter of months. I mean, I always love the quote by Lenin. He said, "Sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and then weeks pass and decades happen."
Mm.
And that's what we're going through right now. And countries, cities, regions, individuals even, they need their friends around the world. And your diaspora are your friends because they're your kith and kin, they're from you.
Mm.
And so countries realize that now, and they're trying to put in place and figure out ways to develop this whole field.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, because I mean, you mentioned the word mobility, and I think that's probably a better word than migration, actually,
Yeah.
because of the migration's a bit loaded. Mobility is a really interesting point, and there's more mobility than there ever has been. I mean, I'm the first generation of my family to have travelled all around the world. The other interesting thing, I think, is that, of course, now we can do everything online. So not only can you go to Silicon Valley quite easy if you want to, but you can also connect with people. Because I mean, I've got relatives over there. It's quite extraordinary, and this has really changed in the last 20, 30 years, hasn't it? I mean, the mobility has been building
Yeah,
for a while, but in terms,
I'll tell you a funny one, Paul. And in 1985, a plane took off from your old neck of the woods, Waterford,
all
and
right,
flew to London. The first flight,
wow,
Ryanair, and they're going to do 220 million passengers this year.
it's
The
extraordinary.
largest airline in the world. I mean, I love the notion nobody starts a large organization. And for your business people, everything starts at zero.
Yeah,
I tell you, the 21-year-old son of a Syrian migrant called Steve Jobs and his 27-year-old buddy, Steve Wozniak, in a garage in Cupertino in California, built the first Apple computer and sold it. And it's a $3 trillion company today. So I love that notion. Nobody starts a large organization.
yeah, yeah. No, it's truly extraordinary some of the things that have been happening. Let me ask you about the journey that you've been on. I mean, obviously you've had a varied background. When you go back to the beginning, I mean, what would you say are the big things that you've learnt along the way? We've talked a lot about what you're doing at the moment, but what would you say you've learnt along the way in terms of the way you've developed as a leader and as a somebody building a business, working with clients and stuff. I mean, what are the big things you've learned?
I think I learned a lot of lessons from sport. Um, I wasn't great at sport, but I was okay. I mean, I played for Leinster, which is a rugby team over here,
Right.
but I wasn't good enough to play for Ireland, which is what was my great desire as a kid, you know. But here's what's interesting: throughout my life, then rugby actually played an important role. So I got posted to a government position with the Irish government in Australia. And I spent 8 years there. When I arrived, I didn't know anybody. I didn't know a sinner in Australia. I met a lot of sinners when I was there, but I didn't know anybody when I arrived. And my mum gave me the name of a neighbour's son, and I called him and I said, I don't know anybody. Could you introduce me to the local Irish business network? He said, there isn't one. I said, why don't we get a few people together? We got like 20 people together and had a dinner one night. And we actually called it the Lansdowne Road Club because Lansdowne Road is where Ireland used to play their rugby matches.
Right.
In a spirit of sporting ecumenism, we dropped the word road because there was other sports. We didn't want to be just rugby. And it started to grow and grow and grow. And I was trying to find somebody who could be a really great leader, a global figure from Ireland who could. And I looked into my rugby history, and the great name was a guy called Tony O'Reilly, who was head of the H.J. Heinz Food Company in the US. But he played for the Lions when he was 18 in
Right.
South Africa in 55. He played in 59. He scored 33 tries. Nobody's ever going to come close to that. He's just a phenomenal guy. But I'm a nobody. But I wrote him a letter to H.J. Heinz Company in Pittsburgh. I said, would you be willing to head up this organization? I couldn't believe it. He wrote back and he said three things. He said, first, I'm really interested in building networks globally of people with Irish connections and in business particularly. Secondly, he said, I'm actually buying newspapers. He was into buying newspapers as well as his regular job. And he said, thirdly, and I couldn't believe this, he said, I'm going to be in Sydney because I'm buying the Sydney Morning Herald or one of the papers there. And I'm going to be in Sydney. Would you be free for lunch? So would I be free for lunch? I was going to write back and say, nah, Tony, I'm busy, but next time. But I met him for lunch and I worked for him for 21 years
Wow.
because at that lunch, I took a photograph of the first test in 1955, the British Lions, as they were called then, against South Africa. And it was a picture of him in the corner. He'd scored a try, and the Lions, the Lions won because the South African missed the conversion straight in front in the last kick of the game. And I asked Tony, "Do you remember that game?" And he said, "Of course I do. Do you remember that player?" He said, "Yes. His name is Jack van der Scheef." Tony passed away about a year and 2 years ago, and I went to see him. He was lying in bed and couldn't speak. But I brought the photograph of that kicker missing the kick, and he said Jack van der Scheef. So for me, the values of rugby and participating in rugby, I played a season in France, was fantastic, and I've always kept that kind of camaraderie and friendship from that game. So if there was one influence in my life, I'd say it was that.
Yeah. I mean, you're the second person that's talked to me about the role that rugby has played in building their business, actually, which is it's quite interesting because those sorts of networks, those sorts of relationships are very strong relationships, aren't they? I
They
mean, I've
are.
had best friendships, people that I've climbed with. I mean, I'm a mountaineer, and those relationships are very powerful. not just in business, but in lots of other ways as well. And it's interesting your point about how those can have a really positive impact over the long term. It's a really interesting point there. Let me ask you about the flip side. I mean, you talk with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot, you're very positive about things, and I've always enjoyed that. Let me ask you about the flip side. Tell me about some of them. I mean, I talk to lots of entrepreneurs. They all tell me they make mistakes. Tell me about the biggest mistake you've made and what have you learned from that?
Well, I remember making a mistake work-wise and having to report back in to Tony O'Reilly about this mistake I made. And his answer I found was intriguing. Look, he said, a lot of boats go out and they don't all come back. And I thought that was kind of a nice way of putting it. So I got a bit of a rap over the knuckles, but I mean, I think he what he was kind of really saying would have been worse not to have tried at all. In other words, was it Samuel Beckett, the great writer, said, try, fail, try again, fail again, better. It
Yeah.
was always a great line. So, I think if you live in fear, and fear does play a factor in all our lives, I think if you live in fear, it'll preclude you from doing things and taking action. And, if that's the case, the answer is always no.
Mm.
And I was basically, I was a fundraiser for the Ireland. I raised money, and most of the answers I got were no.
Mm.
But I always took a no as a delayed yes. So, um, and I think you get somewhat thick-skinned in a way, and you're willing to kind of, barrel through despite the knockbacks.
Yeah. I mean, I think rejection is just part of life, isn't it, really? And the sooner you learn that, the better off you are because,
Yeah,
it just happens. It's,
yeah,
what is it the Chinese say? What cannot be avoided must be welcomed. I mean, in one sense, I always think if you get rejected, then you've learned something. You've learned that that person doesn't want what you're offering, but that doesn't mean that other people don't. So
exactly. Yeah,
you
yeah,
use it, I
exactly.
think.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about what. So, if you were to advise, let's say, a rookie CEO, somebody just starting out to do the sorts of things that you're doing, or that perhaps you've done. I mean, what advice would you give to a rookie CEO, perhaps at the start of their career, or just setting up a business? I mean, you run a consultancy business. I mean,
Yeah.
something like
I-
that. Your advice be?
You know, I think the power of asking. Like young kids understand, they understand asking, but a lot of people don't ask. And I mean, there's a lovely little clip of Steve Jobs saying, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. So becoming good at asking. Um, and I built a methodology around raising funds, and I raised a few 100 million doing this
Wow.
in the US. And it was all about four phases. It was about research, it was about cultivation, it was about solicitation, which is asking, and then it's about, how do you handle after somebody is committed to you? How
Mm.
do you do them then? So, I'm a founder member of an organization called CASE. CASE stands for Copy and Steal Everything. And so when I went to Boston, the first thing I did was find a way to meet the guy who was head of development for Harvard University,
Right.
which is the greatest university in many ways in the world. And Harvard have 45 billion in the bank
Mm.
as a university, and yet they raise more money than anybody else. And it seems counterintuitive, but on the other hand, people give to success,
Mm.
people give to winners. They want to belong to those sorts of ecosystems of people. So I spent a lot of time with this guy, Scott Nichols, who's the head of development in Harvard, and we learned a lot. And then we just took the best pieces from that. They were huge compared to us, but took the best ideas from that and implemented them then for our whole program. Now, I must say, it's a funny thing, but my wife went to Harvard as a student.
All
And
right.
but there's an old line, I don't know if you've heard this, but how do you know if somebody went to Harvard? And the answer is they tell you, right? So we always get a good chuckle out of that. But so there's other institutions and entities out there who've done what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So being really good at asking, being really good at listening. I mean, most people are poor listeners. You wouldn't think it from my discussion this morning, but most people are poor listeners. Most people are narcissistic listeners. In other words, if, if I said to you, Paul, I'm thinking of buying a car, and you said, I got one last week. The guy wanted 20,000. I got him down to 10,000. Super car, great radio, great tires. I said, you've taken my topic and you've hijacked it.
Yeah,
And a lot of people do that a lot of time.
yeah.
So I think listening is a form of activity, and listening not just to what somebody says, but what they're going to say next. And if you ask people, do you know many great listeners? Most people struggle to answer that question. And yet I think it's a really powerful device.
Yeah, and I certainly think when you combine it with kind of curiosity and asking the right questions, I mean, it becomes a very powerful force, would be my take on that. But there's no point asking questions if you don't then listen to the answers, is there? So let me ask you one last thing, because I'm conscious of the time. I mean, you've done a lot and you're still very active. I mean, what is it excites you about the kind of next chapter of the stuff that you're doing? I mean, I know you're doing lots of stuff at a very high level. What is it excites you about that? That what's going to happen next?
So I don't think the world is in a good place right now, you know?
Mm.
So I think that consistently working on things which are ethical, which are moral, which are decent, which reflect the best characteristics of human nature. I mean, I think most people are inherently good, but there's certainly some bad eggs out there. So, and I have a very clear vision of what I want to do over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of creating Ireland as a world center for diaspora engagement for countries all over the world. And the good that that can do, I think, can be really, really significant. And I want to keep it fairly simple. That's exactly what I want to do. I'm building a team of people who are going to, develop this around the world. And by then, I'll be ready to check out, and people will have had enough, and I'll move on.
Not too soon, I hope.
That'd be my hope.
Kingsley, thanks for coming on. Thanks for
Dude, thanks,
talking to
Paul.
us.
Enjoyed our chat.
It's a great thing that you're doing, and I mean, I'm biased, of course, because I come from an Irish background,
There you go.
but
Yeah.
I
I'm
think it's a
from
great,
Waterford, by the way.
it's a
From
great
Waterford.
proposition that you're developing, and I mean, good luck with what you're trying to achieve because it's really valuable stuff, I think.
Great. Thanks, Paul. See
Cheers,
you,
then.
mate.
Bye bye.
Bye.